All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the absolute most fascinating eras in human history, the foundations of colonial America and the motives of discovery. Think about it. Today, crossing the Atlantic takes what, a few hours and maybe a tiny bag of pretzels? But back in the 1400s, it was a near guaranteed death sentence. So today, we're going to dive deep into the real reasons early European explorers willingly crossed those treacherous, unmapped oceans. It is an unbelievable story of ambition, crazy risks, and the powerful forces that literally reshape the globe. I want you to really put yourself in this scenario for a second. Imagine you're a 15th century explorer. You're standing on the edge of a European port, looking out at the vast, churning, seemingly endless ocean. The maps of your day are completely incomplete, literally filled with sea monsters drawn right there in the margins. Your ship is made entirely of wood, and you are completely at the mercy of the wind. Disease, starvation, shipwrecks, these aren't just possibilities, they are actual probabilities. So ask yourself, why on earth would anyone take that kind of terrifying risk? What could possibly compel thousands of people to leave absolutely everything they knew behind? Well, here's our roadmap to figure that out today. First, the great ocean risk. Second, 4 buckets of exploration, then mixing and matching motives, the human side of history, and finally, wisdom, morality, and education. Let's start right off with Section 1, the Great Ocean Risk. You know, there is a massive distinction to be made between curiosity and ambition. Today, if we go explore a new place, it might just be because we're kind of curious. But exploration from the 1400s through the 1600s was driven by intense, burning ambitions. Crossing an ocean wasn't just a casual adventure or some sightseeing tour. It required incredibly powerful driving forces to make the massive risk of death or total financial ruin actually worthwhile. People didn't just pack up their families onto wooden ships just to see what was out there. They were pushed by tough circumstances at home and pulled by the immense promise of what lay across the sea. Moving right along to Section 2, 4 buckets of exploration. So how do we make sense of all these massive historical ambitions? Well, we can actually group them into 4 distinct buckets. Think of these as the 4 primary engines driving the entire age of discovery: political, economic, religious, and social. Pretty much every single major Spanish, French, and English voyage during this era was fueled by one or a combination of these exact 4 motives. First up, we have political motives. Think of this like a giant high-stakes global chessboard. Kings, queens, and national rulers were seeking absolute power and new territory. Planting your flag on distant, newly discovered shores meant securing global influence, and honestly, just as importantly, it meant preventing your European rivals from gaining ground. It was a vicious race for dominance. Just think of the fierce rivalries between Spain and England, literally fighting over the Americas just to keep the other guy from getting it. Next, we have the economic bucket. You know the saying, follow the money? Well, it was definitely true back then. Explorers and their wealthy backers were totally obsessed with finding new, faster trade routes to Asia, but they were also hunting for raw, tangible wealth. We're talking gold, silver, valuable furs, and exotic spices. In an era way before refrigeration, spices were literally worth their weight in gold. A single successful voyage bringing back those resources could yield massive profits and fund an empire for generations. Thirdly, religious motives were an absolutely massive driver, and this worked in 2 main ways. On one hand, you had missionaries whose goal was to convert indigenous peoples and spread their faith across the globe. On the other hand, you had entire communities migrating simply to escape severe religious persecution back home. Think of the Pilgrims sailing to New England. They weren't out looking for gold, they were looking for a place to worship freely, without the constant threat of imprisonment or, frankly, much worse. And finally, we have social motives. While this one might get a little less spotlight, it was an incredibly powerful draw. European society at this time was defined by extremely rigid class systems. If you were born poor, well, you died poor. You couldn't just work your way up to owning a sprawling estate. But the New World, that offered everyday people a rare, unprecedented chance to gain land, elevate their social status, and get a completely fresh start. All right, let's shift to Section 3, mixing and matching motives. Now, the real trick to understanding history is figuring out the primary goal of the person footing the bill. For instance, if a monarch funds a voyage specifically to claim new territory, what is that? Right, that's deeply political. But if a group of families pools their meager savings to sail across the ocean so they can worship freely, that is religious. You always have to ask, who's driving the action here, and what is their ultimate goal? But here's the catch. History is messy, right? It is rarely just one thing. A single historical charter can actually stack all 4 of these buckets together at the exact same time.
Imagine a company chartering a voyage. Actually, just look at the historical Virginia Company. It's backed by a king, which covers the political angle. It promises rich trade profits, so that's highly economic. It explicitly aims to build faith-based towns, which ticks the religious box. And finally, it offers large land grants to everyday settlers, appealing directly to their social ambitions. Multiple motives shapes nearly every single major expedition we study.
Let's dive into Section 4, the human side of history. So, why does all this categorization even matter? Because by identifying exactly why people risk so much to cross the oceans, we can truly understand what happened after they actually arrived. You see, their intense ambitions didn't just magically vanish when they hit land. Those motives explain the incredible cultural exchanges, the massive waves of migration, and, tragically, the intense conflicts that occurred. People following their dreams, their beliefs, and their ambitions shaped the colonies, forged new cultures, and quite literally built the very complex world we live in today. Looking at all that unbridled human ambition brings us to a really profound point raised by our source material today. The curriculum highlights that ambition, whether it's political, economic, religious, or social, desperately needs a compass. True understanding and righteous direction require wisdom. Pointing directly to James 1:5, the source emphasizes that wisdom is given generously to those who ask. These explorers obviously had incredible ambition, but history shows us over and over that ambition without a moral compass often leads straight to conflict and suffering.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Wisdom, Morality, and Education. This brings us straight to the core philosophy of the source we're exploring today, the heroesmartacademy Godly Learner series. This curriculum firmly intertwines biblical morality with education for one very simple reason. Learning historical facts is pretty much useless without a solid moral grounding. In fact, the source argues a really strong point, that education without morality will hurt. Think about it. The colonizers were highly educated in navigation, economics, and politics, but when that education wasn't guided by morality, it often resulted in exploitation and deep, deep wounds that lasted for centuries.
The source material poses a really serious question for us to reflect on. Seriously, ask yourself, what is the point of being highly educated, of being the absolute smartest person in the room, if you completely lack the spiritual grounding to avoid destructive choices? If you use your knowledge to make choices that hurt yourself, or hurt your community, or your future, then what value is that education in the first place? True education is supposed to build up, right? It shouldn't tear down. To tackle this, the series leans heavily on biblical principles that are designed to protect against those kinds of destructive choices. For example, pointing to the promise in Romans 8:6-7, the curriculum emphasizes that keeping the mind spiritual actually guarantees peace. When we engage with history or science or literature through a morally grounded lens, the idea is that we aren't just gaining cold, hard facts, we're gaining the lasting peace that comes from truly understanding our place in the world.
So as we wrap up this explainer on the historical motives that drove the foundations of America, the curriculum leaves us with one final, very powerful thought to guide your own personal journey. You have your own ambitions, you've got your own oceans to cross, and your own future to build. But as you gain your education and chart your own course in life, ask yourself, will you keep your mind spiritual for peace? Think about that for a bit. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking great questions, and keep seeking wisdom.